There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a great city when the systems holding it together finally give out. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of absence. The hum of traffic, the rhythm of commerce, the 10,000 small negotiations of urban life, all of it gone, replaced by the sound of wind through broken glass and the distant crack of gunfire. Washington, D.C., the symbolic heart of the most powerful nation on earth, has become a place defined by that silence. 7 months have passed since Black Friday. 7 months since a modified strain of smallpox, engineered with terrifying precision and spread through banknotes in crowded shopping centers, began tearing through the population of New York City and then outward, following the invisible arteries of a connected nation, reaching all the way to the seat of its government. This is the world of Tom Clancy's The Division 2. A world not of sudden apocalypse but of slow collapse, of systems straining and then failing one by one, of the terrible discovery that civilization is far more fragile than anyone wanted to believe. To understand what Washington has become and why it matters, it is necessary to understand what came before it. The dollar flu and the first wave. The virus became known by several names. Green poison for the color it gave the skin of the infected in their final stages. The dollar flu for the vector of its transmission. Its true designation, as classified files would later reveal, traced back to a single man. Dr. Gordon Amherst, a virologist of extraordinary ability and profound grievance against humanity, who engineered the pathogen and chose Black Friday as the date of its release, understanding that no single day in American life would guarantee wider and more rapid spread among a population already stressed, already crowded, already inclined to ignore the symptoms of illness in the excitement of the season. The response was the Strategic Homeland Division, known simply as the Division. The concept behind it had existed for years, the product of post-9/11 thinking about catastrophic domestic scenarios for which conventional emergency services would be wholly insufficient. Division agents were not soldiers in any conventional sense. They were civilians embedded in ordinary life, trained in secret, equipped with advanced technology, and activated only when the situation crossed a threshold that no other institution could handle. They were, in theory, the last line of defense before total governmental collapse. The first wave of agents activated in New York City discovered almost immediately that theory and reality were separated by a vast and deadly distance. The quarantine of Manhattan, intended to contain the spread, instead created a pressure cooker. The Joint Task Force, a coalition of surviving police, National Guard, and first responders, was overwhelmed. Entire neighborhoods fell to the factions that emerged in the power vacuum. The Rikers, convicts who had escaped the island prison facility that bore their name. The cleaners, workers, and sanitation personnel who had concluded the only solution to the virus was fire. And the Last Man Battalion, a private military contractor originally deployed to protect financial assets, which had been abandoned in the city and had decided to take it for themselves. The first wave agents did not simply fight these factions and disappear into history. Several of them vanished from division records entirely. Among them was a man named Aaron Keener, callsign Vanguard, whose disappearance would cast a shadow over everything that followed. Aaron Keener, the first rogue. To understand the catastrophe that Keener would eventually represent, it is important to understand why he became what he became rather than simply what he did. Keener was, by every metric available to those who recruited him, an exceptional candidate for the division. He was intelligent, analytical, decisive, and possessed of a genuine sense of duty toward the people he was meant to protect. He was activated with the first wave and sent into the chaos of Manhattan believing, as the program's architects had intended, that a trained and well-equipped agent could make a meaningful difference. What he found instead was institutional failure on a scale that broke something inside him. The Dark Zone, a cordoned section of central Manhattan where the outbreak was most severe, had been established as a containment area with the intention that experimental antivirals stored there would eventually allow survivors to be treated. The reality was that the JTF, overwhelmed and undersupplied, surrendered the Dark Zone and retreated. The antivirals remained inside, inaccessible. The civilians who had been promised rescue were abandoned. Keener and other first-wave agents who had been operating in the zone were effectively left behind, their requests for support denied, their situation ignored by a command structure that had simply run out of capacity to respond. The moment that defined Keener came when he escorted a group of civilians out of the dark zone and was denied backup as Rikers attacked them. The civilians died. Keener survived. And in the aftermath of that moment, he made a decision that would reverberate through the entire division narrative. He disavowed the organization that had trained him, recruited other first-wave agents who shared his disillusionment, killed those who refused to follow him, and went rogue. What Keener wanted was not simple destruction. His ideology was more dangerous than that, because it contained within it a kernel of something that was not entirely wrong. He believed the structures of government and institutional authority had proven themselves catastrophically inadequate. He believed that only those willing to operate outside those structures, willing to do what was necessary without the constraints of accountability, could build something durable from the ruins. He was brilliant enough to pursue this vision with genuine strategic coherence, and ruthless enough to do things that no version of legitimate authority could sanction. He spent the months between the first game and the second building, gathering resources, recruiting allies, and developing tools that would allow him to reshape the world according to his own vision of order. Chief among those tools was an advanced biological weapon, a refined variant of the green poison that he had been developing with the assistance of a Russian virologist named Vitaly Chernenko. He had also acquired the original RNA printer used by Gordon Amherst to create the green poison in the first place, a device whose implications stretched far beyond any single weapon. Keener was not simply a rogue agent. He was a man who had decided that the right to determine humanity's future was his to claim, and who had acquired the means to make that claim meaningful. Washington, Indiana ruins. 7 months after Black Friday, the division network that connects and empowers agents across the country goes dark. The SHD network, the satellite-linked system that powers agent smartwatches, enables secure communication, and coordinates operations, simply shuts down. In the middle of this crisis, a distress call reaches agents across the country, drawing them toward Washington, D.C. What they find in the capital is a city that has been fighting for its own survival since the earliest days of the outbreak. The disease spread quickly from New York, following travelers and supply chains and the ordinary movements of a modern nation. The initial response in D.C. followed the playbook. Quarantine zones were established. Sarah coordinated emergency services. The JTF attempted to maintain order. President Waller, who had signed the directive activating the division, died of a heart attack in the early days of the crisis. President Mendez, his successor, attempted to manage the catastrophe, but was ultimately unable to hold the situation together. Before long, Mendez too was gone, and the mass evacuation of governmental personnel left the city without any meaningful central authority. The quarantine on Roosevelt Island became one of the defining atrocities of the DC crisis. People were herded there during the early phase of the outbreak, told they would receive treatment, and then effectively left to die as the situation deteriorated beyond anyone's capacity to manage. The chemical decontaminant DC-62, deployed in several areas of the city in a desperate attempt to halt the spread, proved to have lethal effects that had not been fully understood before. The campaign, Fighting for the Capitol. The operational logic of the division in Washington is straightforward in its outlines, even when the details are extraordinarily complex. Control points must be secured to restore civilian safe zones. The SHD network must be rebuilt, node by node, through the completion of missions across the city. The three factions must be weakened to the point that they can no longer sustain offensive operations, and their strongholds must be taken. And somewhere in all of this, there is a president. Andrew Ellis, who had been serving as Speaker of the House when the crisis began and had been elevated to the presidency through the line of succession as those above him died or disappeared, survived the destruction of Air Force One. He is in the hands of the hyenas, who may or may not fully understand the value of what they are holding. When agents rescue Ellis, he reveals something significant. A broad-spectrum antiviral that could treat green poison exists somewhere in the city. He possesses an encryption key that would unlock access to it. But the briefcase containing the vaccine protocols is held by the True Sons in the capital. The battles to take the three faction strongholds, the Roosevelt Island headquarters of the Outcasts, the District Union Arena where the Hyena Council holds court, and ultimately the Capitol building itself, form the backbone of the campaign. Emmeline Shaw is found and confronted in the Manning National Zoo. The Hyena Council is broken at the arena. And at the Capitol, Antoine Ridgway is killed. The true suns are shattered. And for a brief moment it seems as though the worst is over. That moment does not last. Black Tusk and the Endgame Conspiracy. The Black Tusk arrive in Washington almost before the celebration of the Capitol's liberation has faded. They are not a faction in the sense that the hyenas or the outcasts are factions. They are a private military company, extraordinarily well-funded and equipped, operating with military-grade technology that in some respects equals or exceeds what the division possesses. They move through the city with the precision of a professional army, recapturing everything that agents have spent the campaign liberating, seizing landmarks and installations overnight. The Black Tusk are formally designated the Black Tusk Special Unit, and they operate under the command of Bardon Schaefer. But the organization behind them, the entity providing funding and strategic direction, is the Sokolov Concern, a private defense and technology company whose CEO is Natalia Alexeyevna Sokolova. She is the architect of everything the Black Tusk represents. A private military capability deployed in service of an agenda that has not yet been fully revealed, but whose outlines are deeply troubling. There is a suggestion throughout the endgame content that the Black Tusk are not simply mercenaries. They have ties to surviving elements of the U.S. government, connections to those in the continuity of government apparatus who concluded that the division itself could not be trusted with the future of the nation. This connects to one of the darker lore threads woven through the game's audio logs and intel collectibles, the existence of the Hunters. The Hunters are not a faction in the conventional sense. They are a classified program of operatives trained to hunt division agents who have gone rogue or who are deemed to have failed their mission. What the intel recovered by agents in DC reveals is that the Hunter program predates the activation of the division itself. A cohort of government officials concluded, before the crisis even began, that division agents could not be fully trusted to uphold the mission of governmental continuity if activated. The Hunters were their insurance policy, sleeper killers embedded in the system with the authority to eliminate division agents who became inconvenient. The fact that Keener's USB drive, recovered through the course of the Manhunt seasons, contains a roster connecting this program to high-ranking governmental officials reveals just how deeply the distrust ran on both sides of the relationship between the division and the government it was meant to serve. The endgame campaign to take Tidal Basin, the Black Tusk's primary stronghold in DC, and then the subsequent seasonal content dealing with the broader conspiracy pushes agents into a war against a well-organized and well-supplied enemy that has, in the process of its invasion, revealed that President Ellis himself is implicated in what the Black Tusk is doing. The rescue of Ellis at Camp White Oak turns into his apprehension when the evidence of his collaboration with the Black Tusk becomes undeniable. Warlords of New York, the hunt for Keener. While the war for Washington continued, the situation in New York reached a new crisis point. Keener, who had not been idle during the months of the DC campaign, had returned to Lower Manhattan and had done something remarkable. He had unified the warring factions of that part of the city under his authority, deploying 4 of his most capable rogue agents as his lieutenants, each controlling a section of the territory and each providing Keener with something he needed. Vivian Conley, a chemical engineer who had embedded herself within the Cleaners, gave him access to production capacity and chemical expertise. Javier Kajika, a former Black Ops operative whose skills ran toward stealth and unconventional warfare, controlled another sector. James Dragov, a specialist in heavy weapons who had effectively become the dominant force within the remnants of the Rikers, provided muscle and territorial control. And Theo Purnell, a drone engineer and technical genius, gave Keener the technological infrastructure to coordinate everything. Together, these 4 functioned as Keener's warlords, the governors of a territory he intended to use as the staging ground for his final vision. That vision involved the deployment of Eclipse, the enhanced biological weapon he had developed with Chernenko's help. Eclipse was not simply a more lethal version of green poison. It was a demonstration of intent, a declaration that Keener was willing and able to do what the original pathogen had already done, only worse, in service of a new order he intended to impose on the ruins. Fei Lau, the acting division commander in New York, calls for assistance. Agents travel to Lower Manhattan, now a lawless and fractured environment that carries the ghosts of the first game's events in its geography and architecture. The manhunt for Keener's 4 warlords structures the expansion's campaign. Each warlord must be located and eliminated before Keener himself can be reached, and each encounter reveals more of the ideological framework Keener has constructed around himself. He is not simply angry. He is convinced. He has built a worldview that makes sense to him, one in which the failures he witnessed during the first wave are not aberrations but revelations of something fundamentally broken in the structures of authority he once served. The final confrontation with Keener takes place on Liberty Island, beneath the shadow of a monument to a freedom that the world he wants to build would not recognize. He is killed, but the moment of his death contains a revelation that changes everything. Fei Lao, standing alongside division agents at the moment of Keener's defeat, recovers his rogue SHD network and his intelligence data. The signal that Keener activates in his final moments brings online Anna, an artificial intelligence that functions as the rogue agent equivalent of the division's own ISAC, a networking and coordination system for those who have broken from the legitimate chain of command. And then Lao betrays the division. She takes Keener's network, his data, and his capability and allies herself with the Black Tusk, specifically with Bardon Schaefer, ensuring that everything Keener built will be turned toward Sokolova's purposes rather than being destroyed with him. The revelation of Lao's betrayal is one of the more genuinely shocking moments in the game's narrative, because Lao had been positioned throughout as one of the division's most committed and capable commanders. The reasons behind her choice are complex, drawing on her history and her understanding of the institutional failures that shaped Keener's radicalization, even if she has drawn entirely different conclusions about what to do with that understanding. After Keener, Seasons, Rogues, and the ongoing war. The seasons of post-launch content following Warlords of New York continue to elaborate the conspiracy at the heart of the game's larger narrative. Bardon Schaefer, attempting to leverage his position within Black Tusk after Keener's death, assembles a new cell of rogue agents, embedding them within the existing DC factions. Rikers, Hyenas, True Sons, and Outcasts, using them to wage proxy warfare against the division and weaken it for a final Black Tusk push. The resulting manhunts require agents to identify and eliminate these embedded operatives one by one, unraveling the network Schaefer has built. Carter Leroux, known by the callsign Hornet, survived an earlier encounter with division agents and refused Schaefer's overtures, declaring his loyalty to Keener's memory rather than to Black Tusk's agenda. He reformed his own rogue cell, secured the Eclipse virus formula, and allied with the Outcasts in a renewed attempt to devastate DC with biological warfare. His elimination required assaulting the former Black Tusk stronghold at Tidal Basin, now an Eclipse-ridden installation where his cell had fortified itself. The Factio, the world environmental storytelling. One of the most distinctive aspects of the Division 2 as a piece of lore is the extent to which the story is told not through cutscenes and dialogue but through the environment itself. The developers at Massive Entertainment consulted botanists, first responders, and emergency management experts to construct a Washington, D.C. that feels genuinely and specifically collapsed rather than generically post-apocalyptic. Infrastructure has failed in the particular ways that infrastructure fails when maintenance stops and 7 months of summer, weather, and neglect do their work. Areas have flooded because pump stations stopped functioning. Vegetation has begun reclaiming streets and parkland with the speed that nature reasserts itself when human maintenance is withdrawn. The national monuments, designed to project permanence and power, now project something else entirely. The fragility of the civilization that built them and the speed with which the symbols of power become the ruins of power when the underlying systems give out. The civilian settlements scattered across the map tell their own stories through the choices survivors made about where to shelter and what to defend. Ford's Theater became a sanctuary, expanding outward from its rooftop access points into a fortified community. The settlements are not simply gameplay elements. They represent the attempt to answer the question the game is fundamentally asking. When everything fails, what do people do? The answer the game gives is neither simply hopeful nor simply bleak. Communities form. Hierarchies emerge. Some are protective and some are exploitative. The Division's role is not simply to fight the factions but to make choices about which communities to support and how to build something that might last. The dark zones of Washington carry a particularly haunting resonance given what the lore reveals about how they were created. The Georgetown Dark Zone, where the DC-62 was deployed deliberately before its lethal effects were fully understood, and the East Mall Dark Zone, where a containment storage explosion caused mass casualties, are not simply contaminated areas to be avoided. They are monuments to specific failures of specific decisions made by specific people who convinced themselves that the immediate problem of containment justified the human cost of the methods they chose. The division itself questions the lore raises. The most interesting aspect of the Division 2's lore is the extent to which it refuses to let the organization at the center of its story remain simply heroic. The Hunter program and its connections to governmental distrust of Division agents raises the question of whether the Division was ever what it claimed to be, whether the promise of civilian agents embedded in society, answerable to a mission of governmental continuity rather than to any specific political authority, was ever genuinely believed by those who established it, or whether it was always understood as a tool that would need to be managed and, if necessary, eliminated when it became inconvenient. Keener's rage was directed at genuine failures. The abandonment of the first wave in the Dark Zone, the death of civilians who had been promised rescue, the institutional prioritization of containment over lives. These were real, and the audio logs and collectibles scattered across both games document them in specific, damning detail. His response to those failures was to conclude that the system producing them could not be reformed and should not be trusted. The Division's response is to continue operating within that system while acknowledging its failures, to insist that the mission of protecting civilians and rebuilding society is worth pursuing even through institutions that have proven themselves capable of profound failures. The tension between those two positions is what gives the Division franchise its narrative weight. It is not a story about heroes defeating villains in any straightforward sense. It is a story about what happens to people and institutions when civilization fails, about the choices made under impossible pressure, and about whether the structures humanity builds to protect itself are capable of surviving the very crises they are designed to address. Washington, D.C. as the setting makes this question impossibly pointed. The monuments, the symbols, the geography of American governmental power, all of it is present as both backdrop and argument, insisting that what is at stake is not merely a city but an idea, and that the fate of that idea depends on whether the people fighting for it can hold together the principles it was built on even when those principles are most inconvenient. The Division 2 does not answer that question cleanly. It continues to pose it, season after season, in the ruins of a city that was once the most powerful address in the world.